This project, DiverseCity, is a project that Maytree has been engaged with for over 4 years with our partners at Civic Action. And the objective of the partnership is to diversify at an accelerated pace the diversity in leadership in the GTA in many, many parts of society, corporate boards, not-for-profit boards, etc., etc. We have 9 concrete initiatives that we are working on at this point or have worked on collectively. This project will focus on our research. A few words about how we are defining diversity for our purposes in this project. And we recognize entirely that diversity is many things. It means many different things to many different people. And there is a formal definition coming out from Stats Canada, which is a complete definition of diversity and includes gender, age, disability, Aboriginal status, religion, etc., etc. But in our project, the GTA DiverseCity project, we have deliberately focused on visible minorities and immigrants for a few reasons. So let me explain to you why we have done that. First, we really wanted to keep the project manageable and measurable. While in an ideal world, it's always wonderful to consider all facets of the question, and in this case, all facets of diversity, we didn't think that we would be able to track and measure our success effectively if we used a definition that was too broad. Maybe that is a mountain we climb in the future. Second, and I think this is really important for our purposes, this kind of diversity, visible minority, immigrant diversity, is the defining feature of the diversity of the GTA. Almost half of our population is foreign-born and 40% are visible minorities. So we think, naturally, in a city region like GTA, that it is particularly important for the well-being of our city that we have full inclusion of this diversity at all levels of society and in all organizations. A few words about the research aspect of this project. It's called Diversity Counts. And our objective with this research project that we keep our region honest. We do research, we tell you the facts as they are, we ask you to reflect on what we throw up to you as a mirror of our society. It helps us to better understand how diverse the institutions in the GTA really are. I think people on the line will recognize that we pay in this city region and in this country a fair amount of lip service and aspirational talk on the subject of diversity. But we wanted to know what it was all leading up to. What are the results? And we all know that change happens over time. But if there are real benefits to be had, and this research by Professor Fredette certainly suggests that there are, then it is in all of our benefits to figure out how to speed up these natural time frames, how to make them shorter, quicker, better, sooner, faster is our motto at Maytree, and we hope that Diversity on Board can help. Diversity on Board is a roster of candidates, 1,500 and growing, qualified, pre-screened candidates who are ready, willing, and able to serve on boards. We have made over 480, we have made over 600 appointments to over 580 organizations, and we are now actively involved in working with cities across the world who have looked at this program and said to us, if this works in Toronto, it should work in Vancouver, it should work in Birmingham, it should work in Copenhagen, etc. I will now turn it over to Sue Wilkinson, Director of the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network. We are so pleased to be partnering with the ONN to host this webinar because to a great part, ONN speaks for the broader not-for-profit sector in Ontario. Thank you, Sue.
All right. Thank you, Ratna. It's truly a pleasure to be here, and good morning, everybody. Since the Ontario Nonprofit Network emerged 5 years ago, the issue of governance in our sector has consistently presented itself as a priority at conferences and through other consultations across the province. So we're very pleased to have this opportunity to work with Maytree on ensuring that this very important research is shared with our more than 6,000 network members provincially and beyond. Over the past 20 years, I've had the personal privilege of working for and volunteering with community-based newcomer and settlement organizations. Through this experience, I have gained invaluable first-hand knowledge of the impact of organizational diversity at every level and the importance of committing to building inclusive organizations, boards, and communities. In a community such as Jane and Finch, where I spent 15 years, for example, representation is not possible given the 130-plus dialects spoken. A long history of inclusive organizational and community development evolves in these environments, creating an unparalleled richness on many levels, including improved decision-making and responsiveness, enhanced access to supports, and meaningful leadership opportunities for diverse populations, improved credibility, fundraising, membership, innovation, and freshness of perspective and strategy. And ultimately, diversity truly reflects the values and principles that our sector stands for. However, we are not always the best at documenting, validating, and sharing our experiences. So it is my pleasure to introduce Chris Fredette, who will share with us the outcomes of this important piece of research. Chris Fredette is an assistant professor with the Sprott School of Business in the area of management and strategy at Carleton University. He holds a PhD in organizational studies from York University's Schulich School of Business, where his innovative research earned several important distinctions, including a Public Safety Canada Research Fellowship, the Susan Mann Dissertation Scholarship, and a recently received SHIRK Research Grant. Much of Chris's previous research has focused on diversity on voluntary sector boards, in particular how board dynamics and social capital affect an organization's performance. Chris.
Good morning, and thank you very much for a warm welcome. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us in the webinar today and for joining us in what I think is an important conversation to be had. The research that we're talking about today has been well described so far by our two prior speakers, and it really speaks to leadership diversity in the nonprofit sector across the GTA. We've titled the report Baby Steps, Big Strides, and Bold Stances because I think that what we've captured is a part of and many phases of the journey that the nonprofit sector organizations are going through as we increasingly attempt to better reflect the community we serve. Ratna has already very well described the idea behind diversity in this study and how we've characterized it. She's also described the important other facets that we could consider in the future, but for the purposes of our study, what we're talking about when we say diversity is visible minority status, as Statistics Canada would define it, which really reflects ethnic origin. Importantly, the GTA population in one of Statistics Canada's most recent reports is rated at approximately 40%, representing visible minorities and people of varied ethnic origin. And the second major theme in our talk is governance. And when we're talking about governance, we're really talking about some very specific activities that are the responsibility and the purview of boards of directors. Among these are fiduciary oversight, the legal responsibility to ensure the organization's operating as it should, future strategic planning and setting a strategic direction for the organization. Executive and organizational evaluation, making sure the senior executives are doing what they should be and living up to their contractual obligations. And finally, and perhaps most importantly in the nonprofit sector, safeguarding organizational mission and mandate, ensuring that we don't drift into things that we ought not be involved with or which don't nicely match the mandate of the organization. The project mandate and the guiding questions that we used in pursuing this research are fourfold. First, we wanted to know how diverse are voluntary sector or nonprofit boards in the GTA. We wanted to get a snapshot or a semblance of what this looked like now and perhaps how it compared to the past. We also wanted to know why diversity in the nonprofit sector is so important. What impact people, respondents, organizations out in the field are suggesting that diversity in leadership has on their organization and on their board. And finally and fourth, we wanted to know what tangible ways organizations or what tangible tactics organizations could pursue to maximize the benefits of diversity. Our project methodology was survey-based, and data was collected in 3 waves. Part of the data is from a national survey that I conducted on nonprofit organizations and diversity and governance. From that sample, we sampled about 800 organizations nationally. We extracted 96 of those organizations for this project as being based in the GTA, and so they form part of the sample that we're talking about today. The second and third sets of data collection are directly from the GTA, and they involve organizations in the second case that have had affiliation with Maytree and with the DiverseCity project in the past. Both organizations and then individual board members that have been placed on boards. And the third collection of data is also an electronic survey that was distributed to organizations particularly in the arts, sports, and environmental sector of GTA nonprofits. And the data there is very recently collected and analyzed, and these data have been pulled together into one larger picture of what the sector looks like. To give you a sense of what types of organizations we're talking about, we can first break down by sector that these organizations self-identify themselves as existing in, and we can see that we have organizations from the arts and culture sectors, sports and leisure, social welfare, health and wellness, and of course the environment, among others. We can also give you a sense of the stability of these organizations, and in many cases the growth that these organizations have year on year. Many report, in fact, almost 40% report growth in excess of 10% over the last 3 years, and an additional 17% report growth of positive growth of less than 10%, greater than 0 in that same time period. And we see similarly additions to full-time equivalent staff, to volunteer participation, and to clientele and membership. So we're talking about a fairly wide swath of organizations representing a number of subsectors within the nonprofit community in Toronto and the Greater Toronto area, and we're also talking about organizations that are relatively stable and in many cases growing, which is a nice and positive sign to see in our sector. But when we ask how diverse these nonprofit sector boards are, we get a slightly different picture. What we find is that we see about 84%, almost 85% of the board seats in Toronto, in the Greater Toronto area, among those that responded, held by people that would be identified as white or Caucasian. This is very consistent with data in the past 4 reports, although this year there seems to be a little more growth than there has been in the past, which is a positive sign. And perhaps equally positively, we see that among the organizations that responded, nearly 78% suggest that they have at least one member from visible minority communities participating in their board and their governance activities. So of 420 responding organizations, we're talking about 4,254 board members. 85% of those are identified as of Caucasian origin or as being white. The remaining 15%, a little over 15%, are people from visible minority groups, which isn't nearly reflective of the community in which these organizations are drawn and exist in. Among these organizations, we see subgroup participation ranging from less than 1% attributed to those of Korean descent to as much as slightly more than 3%, almost 3.5% for members of the Black community and South Asian community, respectively. On a more positive note, I would think, we see that almost a quarter of boards are now indicating that they have at least 3 visible minority members, and this result closely mirrors the boards that have a composition of 30% diverse or diversity or more. And this 30% threshold is something that we'll come to later in the presentation as well. So if that's what diversity in nonprofit governance in the GTA looks like, we might ask why. Not only why we care about diversity, but what implication this has for the nonprofit sector. We asked the question to respondents to give us a sense of what kind of pressures they were facing to push them toward diversity. Are there forces on the, beyond the bounds of the organization that are encouraging them to embrace greater levels of diversity in their leadership and their governance? And 4 dominant factors emerged from that collection. we can see government priority and regulation as being a primary one, as is expectations of funders and donors, and of course competitive pressures, which you would expect. But one of the interesting ones that stood out for me was the changing demographics of the community clients, members, or customers. That in much the business case sense of the term, as our clients, as our clientele, as our stakeholders begin to change and demand change, our boards are increasingly feeling that pressure and embracing greater levels of diversity to try to capture and become more representative of the communities and the clientele they serve. When asked in a slightly different way, which is to say, what's motivating the organization to seek diversity from inside, we see benefits of diversity recorded that are both tangible and legitimating. When I say tangible, I mean things like we need to fill an expertise gap. We need people that are going to bring new innovative ideas to our programs. We need assistance reaching out to communities. And those are really tangible gains that we can see from embracing greater groups of stakeholders and becoming more reflective of our community. But there are also legitimacy gains to be had here as well. And the board respondents recognize that. Things like, we feel a moral imperative to becoming more diverse. We think it's the right thing to do. We need assistance in recruiting. We need to reflect the communities we serve in a better way. We want to demonstrate a commitment to diversity. So we see these two things as being equally important and equally reflected in the way that respondents answered our survey. We see, again, the tangible business case ideas, but also the legitimacy seeking and the legitimating sets of motives as well. We know from prior studies, both work that I've done and colleagues in the field have done, that leadership diversity has an impact on governance in particular. It has an impact on the effectiveness of governance. It has an impact on the way the board functions and performs. It opens opportunities for greater creativity, which tends to improve problem solving and impact decision making in real and tangible ways. We know that diversity also has been argued to have an impact on loyalty and commitment to organizations. And we'll touch on that a little later as well.
Hi, Chris. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
I was just going to ask you to speak up a little bit. And,
of course.
And for those of you who are on the line, if you, we've muted most of you, but if you could just double check and press mute if you're not muted.
Thank you, Sandra. When asked, what is the impact of leadership diversity? Respondents answered in some very telling and very functional types of ways. First, we see standing out foremost is that one impact of diversity is on the way in which boards develop strategic directions and the way in which these are shaped. And we see diversity as having an impact on board governance procedures as well. Greater levels of diversity tend to, or the increasing representation of diverse members on the board tend to improve board governance procedures. They contribute to the effectiveness of managing CEOs as well, and of course contribute to building greater and stronger stakeholder relationships and managing these more effectively than otherwise would be possible. But when we take this same question and we break the question down into subgroups, which is to say boards with less than 30% diversity versus those that have developed what we would call a critical mass of diversity, those in excess of 30% diversity, so having 30% or greater diversity, we see that the impacts of diversity are actually increase significantly, and the way that they're perceived to impact and recorded is much higher in the higher diversity group. So if we think of diversity overall as some diversity having an impact on governance along these lines, the strategic direction of the organization, managing stakeholder relationships, etc., we can see that the groups with much higher diversity, 30% and above, those that have reached a critical mass of diversity in their organization, are actually reaping significantly higher benefits. If we look at this in a slightly different way, which is to say, ask the question, okay, how does diversity impact board performance, the way the board functions? We see diversity as having really two strong impacts. One is in the area of ideation. And when we say ideation, what we really mean is being able to bring fresh perspectives, innovative ideas, and new problem solutions to the foreground for boards. We see diversity as having a big impact on that, as reported by our respondents. But also we see diversity as having an impact on what we would call network reach, the ability of the organization to reach out beyond its boundaries, to engage new stakeholder communities, and to improve the connections to the communities that the organization serves. And so we see diversity in terms of board performance and how it functions as having two tangible impacts that are quite significant for the nonprofit sector. If we again take this and break this down by high diversity and low diversity groups, which is to say those with less than 30% diversity or those that have reached a critical mass of 30% or greater diversity in their boards, we see again the green bars beat the blue bars every time. Those that have higher level of diversity are reporting that they're having greater governance effectiveness and building more inclusive boards and organizations. They're better able, in this case, to recruit more diverse members once they've achieved a critical mass of diversity. So what can organizations do to benefit from diversity? Well, one of the obvious conclusions from the report that was recorded over and over are that leaders need to be aware of past practices, historical legacies, and policies that stifle diversity and inclusion in favor of expedience. I'm delighted to see people picking up the gauntlet and starting to talk about diversity with the same heft that we talk about financial considerations. It is the case, it would seem, that when we make diversity a strategic imperative, not just an idealized goal, but a strategic imperative on the board's agenda, it does make a difference in the way that organizations treat and handle issues of greater inclusivity and diversity on their boards. So tangibly, what can we encourage organizations and boards to do? First, perform a demographic audit of your board. Find out how reflective your board is of the community it serves. Second, attract, recruit, and retain with purpose. Once you've got the audit, once you know where you stand, begin the journey, but do it purposefully. And consider building a pipeline for future talent to emerge and to be drawn to your organization. If we think about the conclusion that higher diversity boards are better able to attract and recruit more diverse candidates in the future, building that pipeline starts perhaps not at the 30% level, but builds towards that 30% level and then perhaps becomes a little easier to do and self-perpetuating. As Ratna has already suggested, diversity on board has, Ratna would say, 1,500 qualified pre-screened candidates. So you've grown quite significantly from the numbers I had available. And these are candidates waiting to be placed in suitable opportunities. What else can we do? Well, internally in the board, we need to develop practices and processes that enable, endorse, and encourage meaningful participation in governance activities. Prior work and this work reinforces the idea that we need to stress functional inclusion in leadership and governance. And by functional, I mean putting power and decision-making power in particular in the hands of those who need it most, assigning diverse members to special committees, to task force, where creativity and problem solving are critical. And as we so often find in this sector, as well as others, the decisions are often made at the committee level or at the task force level and then presented to the board for endorsement. We need to have people functionally included in the ideation, the decision-making process, and the problem-solving process, and engaged meaningfully. And the senior organizational leaders that are believers, that are champions of diversity, need to be counted on as catalysts of change. They need to be mobilized and put into the field more actively to drive change forward. Returning to the themes of baby steps, big strides, and bold stances when we think about the conclusions and implications of our report. Participation rates in the nonprofit sector, and especially in board and leadership positions, continue to progress in baby steps. There is some growth year on year in terms of visible minority participation, but it nowhere reflects the 40% of the GTA's population from which these members are drawn and from which these organizations are based. there is at least a glimmer, I would say, of sunlight here in that we now have approaching 80% of organizations with at least one visible minority member on the board. Obviously, this needs to be driven further. In terms of big strides, one of the aspects that stood out to me as being particularly salient and important is the idea of diversity as having strategic importance and the actions taken to formalize diversity practices. No longer, it would seem, for most organizations is diversity sidelined, and for many it's now taking on the quality of a strategic imperative. And we see that reflected in our data, with almost 44% reporting having formal diversity practices, policies, and a working definition of what diversity is. And then among those, nearly 84% saying they include ethnicity, race, and color in their definition, in their policies of what diversity means. Almost 50% identify country of origin within their definitions and working policies, and a further 36%, or an additional 36%, include immigrant and refugee status within their idea of what diversity means and the policies they create around diversity. We do see, in terms of big strides, that executive directors overwhelmingly report the benefits of enhanced fiduciary oversight, improved strategic planning, and contributions to overall board effectiveness that diversity brings. And I think a particularly noteworthy, bold stance in the field is this growing awareness of the role of inclusion as a critical aspect of voluntary success. We seem to be transitioning as a sector, at least the leading edge seems to be transitioning from the idea of diversity as representation, or perhaps even diversity as participation in addition to representation, towards something that resembles much more inclusion and deals with diversity as an inclusive act rather than just a representative one. We do know from this sample, from this survey, from this report, and from others, that diversity contributes meaningfully to governance and to governance effectiveness. And more diversity, at least in this report, seems to amplify these benefits. The impact of a critical mass 30%, the impact of this rule demonstrates that if some diversity makes a difference, more diversity equals more inclusive boards and better governance. And champions of this critical mass diversity approach seem to be doing some tangible things to emphasize building and maintaining inclusive processes, challenging old and historical processes and policies that organizations have had over the years and other factors that lead to inertia to create more positive board dynamics and greater governance effectiveness. And these are the conclusions from this year's report. Thank you very much.
Chris, for that wonderful overview. It's certainly a dense piece of research. I would encourage people to go back on the website, and I know that the webinar will be posted. But I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but since I have the virtual podium here, I'll take the freedom of asking the first few questions. First of all, there are lots of organizations, Chris, grassroots organizations and ethnic organizations, that are in fact very diverse. Have they been included in your research?
We have done a significant number of things to reach out beyond what would normally be considered large institutionalized organizations and to reach towards the grassroots and ethnic origin portion of the sector. I'd say that we have a very representative sample of organizations across the nonprofit sector, and we can say this based on a range of organizational indicators. We can talk about ranges of budgets ranging in the tens of thousands per annum into the tens of millions per annum, and we can also talk about this in terms of full-time equivalents, which have a significant range as well. It's important to note that we reached out with our survey beyond not just the work we've done nationally, but also the work that Maytree has done and the network Maytree has created. And we've reached out into other networks like Ontario Trillium Foundation, who helped us a great deal, as did the Ontario Nonprofit Network, Toronto Arts Council, Sports Matters, Sport for Ontario, Diaspora Dialogues, and the Sustainable Network, or the Sustainability Network, pardon me, to aid in increasing the representativeness of our sample. With that said, I think our interest in this was really diversity on boards. And so if you think about what have been traditionally ethnic organizations, we might say that these are perhaps homogeneous in their composition often, although not always. If we think, for example, of studying organizations that have an Aboriginal mandate and an altogether Aboriginal board, diversity in this organization perhaps isn't the same and wouldn't look the same and would be recorded as being homogeneous in the way that Stats Canada and the way that we've measured it. And of course, as others have said, there's always a concern with the creation of these two solitudes. So going back to your question about are grassroots and ethnic organizations included in our sampling, yes, they are, but not as a focal point. And if we think about how we've talked about diversity and that 30% threshold, an organization that was strictly composed of members that would be identified or self-identified as being black versus an organization which would be mirrored as being solely white, those organizations are seen as equally diverse in our sampling.
Thank you. I think there are questions popping up, but Sue has an interesting question that I think deserves an interesting answer.
Chris, in your research, were you able to look at how diverse executive directors are in our sector?
We certainly did, and it's one of the additional slides that I've included in the event that this question were to pop up today. When we looked at executive directors, and particularly our respondent group, our respondents were drawn from the senior organizational leadership rank. That could be the executive director, as the slide would suggest in blue, or a board chair or president position, which would be reflected in green, or in other cases, the other designation, which may, for an arts organization, include an artistic director or a business director, depending on how the organization itself is structured. When we look at the executive leadership participation, we find something that really mirrors board-level participation as well. Only 14%, or roughly 14%, reported as being from visible minority communities. So again, we're seeing that 85% level of executive leadership being drawn from people of a white or Caucasian background.
Okay, that's interesting. So we have a question from the floor from Norm King. Hello, Norm. Norm wants to know how many organizations in your sample advocate on behalf of visible minorities, or are they non-generic? I'm not sure I understand non-generic. Okay. So let me read his questions. Those organizations with formal diversity policies, are their missions focused on diverse populations or advocating on behalf of diverse? Okay, how many of these organizations are a generic not-for-profit organization? Not sure I understand the question completely, but maybe, Chris, you can make something more of it than I can.
Okay, I think if I were to differentiate organizations that had an advocacy mandate, so organizations that were specifically focused on advocating on behalf of or in favor of diverse populations, those organizations, we actually asked the question, are you a service-based organization, an organization that would fall under the nonprofit services kind of mantra, versus are you an advocacy organization? In terms of advocacy organizations, we actually held those out of sampling at the national level as well as in our sampling. And we did this for a couple of reasons, because we wanted to look at what the actual service, nonprofit service sector looked like rather than the advocacy sector. And so the sampling that we've got here that we're showing today in terms of advocacy organizations, there are none included, to the best of my knowledge, as respondents would identify themselves. There are none included in our sampling.
Okay, I have a question for you, Chris, from Naki Asute. How diverse is the 30% that you talk about? Is this diversity from one ethnic group? And if that's the case, do you still maintain the benefit of the critical mass?
Okay, so I think what I'm understanding the question to be is, how did we measure diversity in terms of this 30%? And why choose that as a critical mass threshold?
No, I think that the question is how diverse is the 30% and whether or not you're seeing like the 30% is a homogeneous group, so are they all drawn from one particular ethnic background, and whether or not that made a difference to the critical mass.
Good question.
So
no, I would say
within
that
diversity.
I'm sorry?
Diversity within diversity is the question.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say that in terms of how diverse is the critical, is the 30%, we would, by and large, most frequently, although I think there were maybe 3 exceptions in the sample, we would see diversity as multiple categories. And so the critical mass wouldn't be, for example, 4 members of the South Asian community and 8 members, or 6 members, I suppose, of the black community, but rather we would see some members from the South Asian community, some members from the Chinese community, some members of Arab descent, and some members of another group. So we're seeing more of a mosaic flavor rather than a coalitional flavor in the data that we're seeing.
So the questions are coming fast and furious. Here is one. Did you differentiate between immigrants and Canadian-born visible minorities in your sample?
We did not in this sample.
Okay.
We did ask questions around immigrant participation and processes around the inclusion of immigrants within governance, which aren't reflected in this report, but we did not differentiate Canadian-born people of color versus immigrant populations of color as well.
Okay, Chris, can I just build upon the question that I asked you related to EDs? Brian Smith from Wood Green has a question related to whether any data was collected related to management positions, because certainly, you know, we understand that current EDs may be predominantly white, but in larger organizations, and many organizations actually, there's a very deep commitment to be really looking at the next generation of leadership in our sector. And was there any data on diversity for other management positions?
No, the report focused specifically at senior organizational leaders and boards and governance. And so we did not collect data about the internal workings of the organizations or how deeply diversity may penetrate down through the organizational chart or whether diversity was greater reflected in the volunteer group versus the for-pay group or vice versa.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Here's another interesting question. How many boards were led by visible minorities, where the board chair was a visible minority?
Well, we can deduce from the respondent set that board chairs are going to be a subgroup, and I could probably get back to you with the exact figure in our sample, but overwhelmingly the senior executives that responded to our survey were predominantly white. We know that if we take the Caucasian group out, we're left with about 15%, which we can then break up amongst 12 other visible minority status and then break that up by position as well.
So it's not a majority, you're suggesting?
I'm not.
Okay. There is a question as well, an interesting one that we often get asked, so I'd like to have an academic answer that we can build on. What about vismins on boards as tokens? Did your research indicate any biases towards tokenism versus real inclusion? Were there any questions that you asked that led you to some conclusions on this?
Well, we didn't get into the politics of asking a single source respondent to make a judgment about whether they felt the board members had been recruited for tokenistic purposes or whether board members felt as if they were tokens on their board. I'll make 2 comments, one at the board level, which is to say that rather than looking at tokenism, I've looked at representativeness. And if your board is composed of 12 board members, and you have one member who seems to be of a community or representative of a community that is viewed as terribly important to your board, this may be an issue, and you may want to dig into process to find out how meaningfully engaged this person is. The senior executive leaders that have responded to our survey suggest that meaningful gains are a result of meaningful engagement, and that the members, visible minority members on their boards, are meaningfully engaged, more so than not. The flip side of this, which is how do board members, visible minority board members, the 300 that we surveyed, what is their experience with regard to engagement, inclusion, participation, and tokenism? And those members, by and large, although not entirely, report that their experiences on boards, their experiences with leadership and with governance are terribly meaningful, that participation, assignment to committees, engagement with problem solving and decision making at the board level, acting as functionally included members of the board, is a powerful reason for them to stay and a significant aspect of their fulfillment working with the board.
Okay, Chris.
So, as an academic, I would always be worried about tokenism and the instrumental rationale for recruiting people from diverse communities. In the sampling, I can suggest that there was less of that than you would expect, both as boards report it, but also as organization members or board members report it.
Okay, just in tying into that, because this is probably very much related, how many of the organizations that you surveyed, how many of them had diversity policies, and what did these look like?
Sure. So we report in, I believe it's the second or third from last slide, that approximately 44% of the organizations report having first a working diversity or working definition of what diversity means to the organization, and then second, report having policies in place, policies in terms of recruitment, policies in terms of retention, policies in terms of socialization to the board. Some people talked about cultural ambassadors, providing diverse members or members from diverse communities with cultural ambassadors to get them acclimatized and integrated into the functioning of the board. Others talked much more about the strategic recruiting and how we were going to integrate members from diverse communities into the governing of the organization.
Thank you. The questions are still coming fast and furious. There are a couple of questions that I think are more aimed at the Diversity on Board project, and if I may, I'll quickly address them. There's a question from Joel Christensen about whether the research recorded the stories and experiences that diversity, that organizations had made in their journey to diversity, and yes, these videos and YouTubes will be going up very shortly on Diversity on Board. Brian Smith, hello Brian, asks a question about a variety of skill sets that boards need, and do we have information whether diverse representations come from one or a number of skill areas. I'm going to just answer the question, if I may, from what we know of our 1,500 database of ready, willing, able candidates. There's, of course, always, especially with visible minority candidates, an oversupply in the financial services and financial acumen and fiduciary responsibility, as well as a lot of lawyers who are on this list. But in addition, we ask for strategic planning, fundraising, stakeholder management, community development, human resources, risk management, business, and general governance skills. So do go on our website. The project was created so many years ago because people used to say to Maytree, we don't know qualified people. We've taken that risk away from them. At least in this city, there are 1,500 ready, willing, able, pre-screened, pre-qualified candidates who are able to serve on your boards depending on your needs and requirements and your context. So here's a question, Chris. How does the GTA compare to other jurisdictions in Canada or around the world?
Well, I can speak to the Canadian context, and I can suggest that in the research that we've done nationally, we see what we've begun to call the MTV effect, the Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver effect, as being three distinct cities within an otherwise different population nationwide. Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver are far more, pardon me, I'll speak up just a touch. Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver are, of course, far more diverse than many other pockets of the country. And one of the most recent census Statistics Canada suggested that the country itself is approximately 85% Caucasian. Of course, when we look at Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, we see something quite different than that. And so if we look at comparisons nationally, I think the only fair regions to compare Toronto or the GTA's experience to are Greater Montreal and Greater Vancouver. And of course, diversity within each of those communities is a little different than what we find in Toronto as well. Internationally, there's been a reasonable amount of research done, and it continues to grow. And if you're interested, by all means, contact me, and I can point you at international comparisons.
Okay, Chris, I have another question for you. Is it true that the larger and more established an organization is, the less diverse it is?
This is an interesting question because it suggests two things. That as we get bigger, it's harder for us to increase diversity, and as we get bigger, we tend to be older, and age would create other forms of inertia inside an organization, whether that be historical legacy or, as someone else suggested, this lack of a managerial pipeline, these types of things. In this research and in prior research that I've been involved with, we find that age and size and other similar factors that lead to inertia are far less important determinants of diversity than are things like the level of formalization in the organization. To what degree and in what quality has the organization got formal policies and procedures, just in general, without even getting into the topic of diversity? Has the organization got a relatively formalized structure to it? And if it does, that tends to make the organization more diverse and more easily able to diversify its leadership in the future. The second factor that we can say that often has an impact is the level to which the organization has institutionalized diversity practices. For example, to what degree do you have a working definition of diversity that's understood at the board level? To what degree is the board actually engaged in annual demographic audits? To what degree has diversity become a strategic imperative in the sense that it has the same heft and is given the same gravitas as financial and other issues? To what degree is the organization setting targets and goals? And to what degree is the board setting diversity-based targets and goals and then monitoring and trying to live up to those? The degree of formalization and the degree of institutionalization seem to matter in a significant way because they entrench the policy, they entrench the practice, and they give it the heft that it needs to signal that it's important organization-wide.
Thank you. One of the interesting outcomes of research I always think it should get us to think a little deeper, but it also should lead to some action and ideas. So we have a very interesting idea coming from Gary Peters, hello Gary, who suggests that maybe someone should organize a recruitment summit to bridge the gap between those organizations who have the lowest representation and diversity on their boards to candidates, sort of like a candidate summit. Let us know, people in the audience, if this is a good idea. He suggests that it be funded jointly by boards looking to improve access and increase their leadership. Maybe Gary is the action hero here. Maybe he can expand on this idea and take some action there. Certainly, people are there. It is a myth that visible minorities do not have the experience to sit on large sector boards. Close to 60% of our candidate list has identified exactly those kinds of competencies. Most of them come from business, and they're not on boards quite simply because no one ever asked them. So here's a very interesting question. I know the answer to this, but it deserves to be asked. How does the not-for-profit sector compare with other sectors? Like, how does it compare with the public sector? How does it compare with the corporate sector, etc.?
Chris, if I could jump in, if you don't mind. The diversity counts in the first 3 years looked at various sectors and compared them, and the previous reports are available on our website. The corporate sector was unfortunately the least diverse, and governments and government institutions were more diverse than other sectors. I believe it was the Toronto area agencies, boards, and commissions that were the most diverse when we compared the sectors. Education also ranked high. In addition, we looked at the media and the justice system. And when we looked at the media, we looked at who was telling the news and also how the news is reported, so how diverse the sort of press coverage is. So for those of you who are interested, it might be worth taking a look.
I think it is interesting, if I may, to make the point that the not-for-profit sector, from a value base, should be further ahead than it is, because it certainly has the values, it expresses them, it aspires to them. So it is surprising that given that value base, action hasn't followed words. So we hope certainly that this research will propel us to some action. I think we are almost done with time, and so we will have to end the press conference. There are lots of comments about where can we have a deeper discussion, how can we find information, etc. All of this will be posted on our website. And if you have further ideas for action, I really would encourage you to email. You've got an email on the screen if you want media interviews. If you want to host your own webinar, I'm not offering up Chris for eternity, but if there is a sector, let's say, if there is the environmental sector, which we know has special challenges in diversity, if they want to organize their own sector webinar with Chris, we'd be happy to mediate that for you and persuade Chris if that's possible. So we can give lots of legs to this conversation even post-webinar. First of all, I'd like to thank Chris for his presentation and wish him all the best, and thank him for bringing these interesting and important issues to our in the public. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question and would still like to ask one, just email us and we'll try and get back to you. On Friday, you know, I mean, this is an interesting aspect of this project. We've given you the research. On Friday, we come out with 10 top tips for diversifying your board. This conversation will be hosted with Charity Village. Chris and my colleague Sandra Lopes will be participating in another virtual conversation, this time coupling research with action ideas. So if you're interested in joining that conversation, the Charity Village site has been listed somewhere here, and it will be at 1 o'clock on Friday. I want to thank all my colleagues for helping us with this. I want to thank our partners at Civic Action, always standing by our side and encouraging us, my colleague Sandra Lopes for managing this project as always wonderfully, and Sue Wilkinson, thank you from the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network for your interest. Thank you and goodbye. We are adjourned.